Okay.
Just one thing very, very quickly. When we were dealing with the Mishnah, just three concepts. We're going to fly through it. The first concept that we had to deal with is this issue, um, as as you uh, as you remember. Just give me one sec, guys. That if you threw a stone in a public area and killed a bystander, you obviously exiled. But if you thought that the path was clear and some idiot stuck their head out in the stone's way, but they weren't there prior to it discharging from your hand, there's exemption from exile. So that's Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov. We're going to see what that actually means. The next section deals with a permission. In other words, what does this permission actually deal with? Is that if you have a choice of your own volition to enter an area and you don't check that anybody else is in that area, if it's a public space, where the perpetrator and the victim have a right to enter, there's liability and exile. It does contrast it with two issues. The first issue is that if you're doing a dangerous activity in your own property and somebody enters there, um, then the onus is on them to check where they have no permission to be. It's like on a construction site. And the last point by Abba Shaul is that it says, look, if it's a voluntary act, uh, then there's liability for the law of exile, but not for an involuntary act. So it brings three different cases. The first case of the fact that a father is admonishing a son and gives him a clap and inadvertently kills him, he's not eligible for exile there. The same as a teacher that chastises his pupil, and the same as an agent of the court who inadvertently kills somebody in the performance of his duty uh, by administering lashes. We already said that Tosfot doesn't agree that if there's any sort of aggressive, out of line behavior, then certainly both a teacher and a parent is liable for killing. If the act is a dangerous act of chinuch as opposed to a little putz, he actually beats him, then certainly there's liability there. But in the normal case of events, sometimes an accident can happen with a mild beating. And the example that is used is an agent of the court. They do a medical assessment of the sinner to see how many lashes he can take from a physiological health perspective. Does he have any pre-existing conditions? What's his age, etc.? And when they determine this, the agent of the court has an expertise not only in terms of lashing, but he doesn't have the same point of frustration that either a parent might have or a teacher might have, so they have to be careful. So all of this is, if anybody's killed while performing a mitzvah, they're exempt from exile. And the Gemara is going to bring a case of building a sukkah, or certain other examples is if you chop wood when you have to build a sukkah or create a wood for a mizbeach, what's the liability level? Okay, so let's get straight into the Gemara. We're just dealing with the first part. And it said, okay, look, so you throw a stone in the public domain, and it's if that's the case, you've killed deliberately. So if you that liable to exile because it's bordering on the deliberate, how can the Mishnah rule on that basis um, in terms of that is exiled? In other words, um, anybody that actually throws a stone in a public domain or discharges a firearm, that's bordering on gross negligence. So why would you even think that you could have the leniency of being exiled to have protection and refuge from the Goal Adam or the atonement aspect? It's different to chopping wood, which could be hazardous, but it certainly doesn't have the malevolent intent. So Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak said, look, the Mishnah is speaking of a person who dismantled his wall adjacent to the public domain, and in the process, a stone fell and killed. So it said it's not as if the person actually threw a stone. It meant that that person's ownership of the stone created the damage. So the Gemara says, okay, so we hear that. But firstly, it was his stone, and he should have checked to see if anybody nearby might have been injured if there was construction that would have affected the public, and not doing so so grossly negligent that it's still subject to exile. He might not have used it as a projectile, but if you've got a high wall and it isn't concretized properly, there's a liability there. And the Gemara said, okay, so if he should have checked to see if anybody was nearby who might have been injured, um, not doing so is definitely grossly negligent. So why should there be a leniency um, and say that it's not subject to exile? If you want to say it's not subject to exile because it's bordering on gross negligence and almost of intent, different story. So the Gemara says, look, it's talking about a specific case where the dismantling of his wall occurring at night. And generally at night, you don't expect anybody to be in that area because of the amount of thievery and crimes that were committed at night. It's not just in South Africa that people didn't leave their private domains in general, unless it was an area like the town square or there was adequate security. And the Gemara said, okay, so he did it at night, but it could also be seen as grossly negligent because it could be in an area where people frequent. So it specifically states that it's in a suburban area where people don't have vagrants at night. It's not, for example, a city center entertainment district, and therefore it's not likely that people would be there. So Gemara said, on the basis that you think it could be a level of gross negligence, the two other factors is number one, it happened at night, and number two, his wall is adjacent to a garbage dump. And you don't expect people to be at a garbage dump. So the Gemara said, well, okay, you don't expect wealthy people to be at a garbage dump, but certainly vagrants use it as a latrine because a garbage dump is where you might have bad smelling feces and urine, and therefore they're not going to be allowed to relieve themselves in a more upmarket area. So since it's rotten food, defecation, and urination is basically what's stored at the garbage dump, if you happen to dismantle your wall or throw a stone in an area where vagrants could frequent, even at night, you're absolutely responsible because it can't necessarily be seen as that person's a victim of an unforeseeable accident. So Rav Papa brings on this is that, look, the Mishnah is necessarily only speaking in a case where a garbage dump is used by the public to relieve themselves at night, not just vagrants, and therefore there's liability. But during the day, because apparently, according to Rav Papa, it wasn't just vagrants. There wasn't exactly plumbers.co.za. So people had obviously open areas in the outback at which they could relieve themselves. So that does have a degree of liability. Um, but he's saying that if you manage to throw stones or dismantle your wall near a garbage dump during the day, you've got to assume that people are dumping their garbage there and there's full liability, so you're not subject to exile. But it's referring to specifically a public area of garbage disposal at night where it's not frequented by many people and mainly hobos. And even then, you have to be careful. But because the probability is low, um, dismantling your wall is allowed, but certainly not throwing a stone. And therefore, that's considered not gross negligent and you're liable to exile as far as that's concerned. Now, the next section of the Mishnah deals with this issue with Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov. Okay? And it basically states that the rabbis learned in a brisa um, that, okay, so what did Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov say? That if a victim placed himself in the projectile's path after it was released, and that's the key word, after, the thrower is not subject to exile. And the rabbis taught in a brisa that you have to look at this word umatzah, which means and it found. So, in other words, it excludes somebody who presents himself to be killed. In other words, you throw the stone and somebody popped their head through and said, "Hi, how are you?" So from not being found, they're now being found. That's when it uses that term. And from here, Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov derived that it was only after the stone left his hand that the victim thrust his head out and received the blow, and therefore the throw is completely exempt from exile, because that's bordering on negligence from the victim, not the perpetrator. So it says um, the Gemara is basically saying, what do you mean that this word found, matzah, implies finding something that was there from before? Okay, in other words, how do you come to this definition? You could find a lost object. What are you saying? So the Gemara is saying, look, there's a specific sentence that's used, memimara de matzaya, which basically is a repeat of a statement that is used in a different part of the pasuk. And if you have a look, if you remember, it says a guy was chopping wood in the forest, and the wood chips found his fellow man, and he died. So that means he found his fellow man, is that the person was presented in the forest along with the perpetrator, meaning that it's a public area where anybody can be found, and therefore you would have to check before using your axe. So it obviously excludes somebody that suddenly comes into the area. Now, they use this particular challenge and they say, look, where is the source of this? Um, and it's basically an area that deals with ancestral land which should have been sold. So, how do I put it? Okay, so if you look in Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 25, verse 26, it's got this whole statement. If a man will have no redeemer, but he will acquire means and he will find enough for its redemption. So, guys, I'll tell you what it's talking about is that if a Jew is forced to sell his ancestral lands, the Torah provides mechanisms for him retrieving his property. So if the seller has relatives and he's fallen upon hard times, obviously it's a mitzvah for them to redeem the field for the buyer. But if he has no relatives, but he finds the means to redeem the property himself, the buyer must make it available for him to repurchase. So it's talking about a case that he's inherited land from his family. He hits upon hard times. He sells the land in Eretz Israel. And he then does acquire the funds. He has to be able to buy back the land for the same price that he sold it for. And obviously, it has certain conditions. One of those conditions is that he doesn't have any other assets or property or cash flow available at the time. Why? Because it's trying to protect the buyer to a certain extent. How is it protecting the buyer? Because what you might think is, as the Bryce said, is that what you want to do is you want to buy another property closer to where you live. And you want to maybe smash down both the properties and build little townhouses. So you've got ancestral land, but it's about 2 km down in Israel. But it's not going to help you to have adjoining property. So what you're thinking of doing is basically selling that ancestral land, getting the money, buying a property closer to you, using this trump card of getting the ancestral land back at what you paid, at the point where you're starting to make money on both the properties being joined and using them as townhouses. So you can't take advantage of the buyer that way in order to get a closer properties to sell the further one away that happens to be ancestral and expect with the proceeds to buy it back to what you sold it at later. That's number one. You also can't use it to manipulate the game where the property that you inherited is of inferior quality from an agricultural point of view, or the suburb is slightly deteriorated. Um, and then what you want to do is for that same value buy higher quality lands. So Lance and Gavin Simpson and Aidan weren't there above a comer. The basic principle there is that there are three different types of lands and three different sizes of land. So in principle, we were talking about dealing with creditors and paying back debts, etc. Is we'd say that the highest quality of land would be the smallest piece, a medium quality land in terms of agricultural yield and quality of produce is a medium-sized field, and the lowest quality of land in terms of the soil composition and the weather conditions, etc., is the largest property of land. So they said, look, in that particular case, if you owe money, you should pay from your best quality land, even though it's smaller, because it allows your creditor to sell that land quickly, as it was an agrarian society, and agriculture was why they bought land in terms of the quality yield of the crop. So that would go quickly, even if the land's smaller. But in lieu of the fact that you can't pay the debt, you could go to medium or lower quality land, providing commensurately you gave a larger portion of land. So in that particular case, what we are saying is what we want to stop a Jew from doing is taking advantage of another Jew by selling inferior quality land, using the profit to buy a higher quality agricultural soil-based land, and then later claiming that you didn't have any funds and wanting to buy back your ancestral lands once you sold your crop for the same price you paid it. So these are rules to basically protect the buyer. So what's the overlying principle here? Is that the Torah is giving the right of redemption only for changed financial circumstances, but not merely a change of heart. And what that means is if you have ancestral land, but you come unstuck financially and you have no other assets, at that point, when you get the money back, you can buy back the land that has been in your family heritage for the same price as you paid it, but not to get cute with some financial transaction. So this is where the word matzah found is taken to mean, is that um, something found afterwards that did not exist before. So what does it mean? Is it basically means that, and he will find enough for its redemption, meaning um, that if a man will have no redeemer, but he will acquire means and he will find enough for its redemption, meaning that at the time, if he had no assets apart from the ancestral land and needed to sell it, there were no other assets to be found, and therefore he can buy it back at the price that he sold in order to protect his family heritage. However, if it was found that he had other assets at that time, he cannot buy it for what he sold it for. So this word found means it wasn't there before. There was no other land available before that he could use to sell before he sold that ancestral land. And therefore, it's using the same word matzah, found, to emphasize the word that just like there was no other property or assets or cash that this Jew could find to pay off his debt and therefore had to sell his ancestral land. Um, eh, so too in this particular case, if you throw a stone and suddenly you found somebody in your way, but the stone had already left your hand as a projectile, there's no liability. So it uses a gezerah shava. So Rava says, look, in the case of the wood chipping incident or accident, we interpret according to the context of the verse, and the same with regards to ancestral land. It's all about the context of the verse. So uh, the term any will find has the same connotation as the preceding words. In other words, he will find the means at which to uh, buy the land, meaning that if he has the means before, he doesn't get it at a discounted rate, but he has to pay full price. He just wanted to sell that land. And it's basically a concept of time, meaning from now on forward. And so too, it's analogous to the case of a forest, where basically the wood chips or the axe handle found the man and implanted that damage and killed him. So it's talking about a case of not present then. There were no financial means present then. There was no person in the forest found then. And therefore, you could use that particular term to derive the same conclusion. All right, does everybody understand before we go on? It's pretty straightforward. Okay.
Yeah, all good.
All right, good, good. So the Torah quickly goes on the next section of the Mishnah with Abba Shaul. He says, look, if you take this Torah's wood chopping case, that exile is only a result of a voluntary act, not an obligatory one. So a certain rabbi asked Rava, what do you assume that the wood chopping accident refers to a voluntary act? Maybe the Torah speaks of one who was chopping wood for a sukkah or chopping wood for an altar. And both those acts are required for a mitzvah. They're not matters of choice, they're obligatory. And why does the merciful one say that the killer in that case should be exiled? Because you're comparing it to a case of it's not a voluntary act for a father or a teacher to reprove their son or student, nor for a court agent to administer lashes, because it's a mitzvah to make sure that discipline is given. And therefore, how could you say in that case they're not exiled, and in this case there is exile? So basically, Rava answered and said, look, there is actually no obligation to chop wood for a mitzvah of a sukkah. You can either pay somebody who already has got chopped wood and not endanger anybody, because if that wood is chopped, obviously nobody has died as a result, otherwise they wouldn't be around to sell it to you, they'd be in the city of exile. Nor do you need to have wood chopped for the Mizbeach, because again, you can buy chopped wood. So since it's conceivable to fulfill the requirement without performing any sort of cutting or chopping aspect, and you can merely buy the wood, there's no such obligation. The obligation is to build a sukkah. The obligation is to do an offering, but it's not an obligation to chop wood for that offering. Get it done by somebody else that's used to it and that there's no risk associated. And Ravina challenged Rava from our Mishnah, who says that this excludes from exile the father who hits his son and inadvertently kills him, and the teacher that chastises his pupil and the agent of the court while performing his duty. So, in other words, they're saying if Rava's ruling is correct, uh, this is what Ravina says to Rava. If your ruling, Rava, is correct, what do you have to? There's no obligation to hit or chastise him in order that you force him to learn, but yet you classified as a mitzvah obligation. So Rava answers, look, in the case of a father, even if he learns his lesson by having one club, it's still a mitzvah obligation to hit him on occasion, because it's written, chastise your son, and he will bring you rest, and he will bring you delights to your soul. So the bottom line of it is, it's in Proverbs chapter 29, verse 17. All it's saying is, look, the whole implication of corporal punishment is that a parent and a teacher has a long-term goal. Let's take high school, for example, for the next 5 years, of making sure that somebody in grade 8 or standard 6 that gets to grade 12 doesn't end up being a juvenile delinquent. And therefore, in the beginning of grade 8 or standard 6, if you give them one crack and say, be good for the next 5 years, it's not going to last. Nor are you allowed to beat that child as a parent or as a teacher. But on occasion, we used to get caned, and we didn't know when we'd get away with it or when we get caned. So the mere prospect of it having gone very badly was enough to deter us. Well, it deterred me from getting caught, not from doing the wrong thing. But in most people, it deterred them from doing the wrong thing. And therefore, what Rav is saying to Ravina, it doesn't help just because it's not obligatory to do a almost a deterrent factor of giving your son or your pupil a smack and doing it once. It's a continual job to make sure that you have give a proper education with sporadic discipline that's not over the top should that student not particularly perform well. And what you can do is just give them occasional pats for added motivation. Um, so he's saying it is a mitzvah, even though it's not regulated in terms of the amount of um, regularity, and you have to deal with it on a case by case basis. Um, so uh, Rava now offers another response to Ravina's challenge. He says to Rava, "Look, I thought about what you said. What I said is nothing. Rather that whoever comes with his fellow into the forest." Um, you've got to assume that there is somebody going to be there, and therefore for anything requiring a mitzvah obligation, whether it's chinuch or the chopping of the wood, they're two very different topics. And therefore, as far as chopping wood for an altar and a sukkah, I agree with you that all you have to do is build a sukkah and give an offering to the mizbeach, but you don't have to be involved in the wood processing. But you need to check who's entering uh, the forest. And as far as chinuch is concerned, both with educating a pupil and your son, you would need to be very careful that that act is not based on a abusive or excessive reprimand of a physical nature, although it hasn't been categorized as to the frequency. The severity has been under scrutiny, and they're going to see if there's any abuse that's taken place. But it's done within the parameters of chinuch. It has to just be monitored. So he agrees with him, but under certain parameters. Um, and Rava answers that this word va'asher, used in the wood chopping incidents, implies an option. And Rav Adabar Ahava said to Rava, look, is it true uh, that it's an option? In other words, um, I think before we get to this whole issue about whether or not to go to a forest, it's now going to go to a whole issue of if you go to a mikveh and if you find a dead body and Tara and Tuma, which is going to be quite a complicated issue in terms of obligation. And it's going to go through. So I think it's enough for today. Anything here didn't make sense, guys? Everybody looks
Yeah,
exhausted.
no, it makes sense then. The one other thing, wasn't there also a thing with the land is when they buy it and when they sell it, when it's fertile and it's not fertile as well, like when the
Yeah,
seasons are coming up.
yeah, yeah. So what Arthur's
Baba Kama.
mentioning
That was another
is that
statement.
there's a Tishrei period and a Pesach period. So land has a worth depending on whether it's seasonal or not in season. In other words, if it's already yielded a full crop, um, and you're selling the produce along with the field, that affects the price. Whether you buy in Tishrei, at which it's entering spring, affects the price. Because if you're having to pay for the land now and it's in Tishrei, which is entering the cold season, you're not going to be able to use it till Nisan when it starts to become warmer. So in the meantime, you're paying expenses on the land and you can't generate. So that land has a lower value if you can't immediately use it. Then there's also issues of the Shemitah year, and if you can't work the land during that period, it affects the value to a certain extent. So those factors do come into play. But just I want you guys just to end off on the note that you mustn't come up with this assumption that you're entitled to beat your child or beat your student, but that merely if an accident happened within that context of education, it wasn't like it is now, but it was deemed as though there was no um, excessive force nor uh, unusual regularity, but it was within the confines of what was deemed acceptable as laid out by the Beis Din. Then in that case, that person wouldn't go to exile if it was obviously under chinuch, because that would be determined as a mitzvah, and therefore it would be seen as accidental. I can't really wrap my head around this. I'm just teaching it. We come from a different time period. Uh, Remember, Gavin Simpson, you said you enjoyed that whole like camaraderie and getting caned and everything else. It wasn't my best. I don't know what your frequency was.
Yeah, no, it was quite frequent, but this is different though. I mean, I also can't wrap my head around this one either. I mean, I understand, for disciplines, some things like that. But it just seems odd. I mean, we're just different, we can't fathom, we're gonna start smacking a little Lati because he's not learning the Shema correctly or Tosfot correctly. It doesn't make sense. But yeah, I think it's just different times. So it's also like I'm not sure what form are they using the word mitzvah, right? Oftentimes, God give me a glass of water, little boy. That's a mitzvah. So is this the same content, or actually say this is a mitzvah of education? It's part of the education practice of teaching Torah to your children. I don't know, but it seems odd. Maybe just different generations. We can't appreciate it.
Well, it's like I was listening to KFM this morning, and they were talking about even now, and when Simpson was a kid, Darren was a kid, things are different. It's like now, you send your kid to a thing and they break their arm, they come back, they're going to get you on social media, they're going to sue you, they're going to do this, they're going to do that, they're going to ruin you. In my day, you broke your arm, you phoned the dad or whatever, said, okay, give him a panado. Okay, he's a broken, send him to the hospital. That was about it. And he'll recover. That's how we were. Different generation there to this new generation.
Yeah, no,
So how
listen,
they think even today.
yeah, we didn't have safe spaces and all this woke cuck. I'll
No,
give you that much.
I'm just saying, even these couple of years, like it's totally. I mean, we can't even imagine back. I mean, the kids today can't even imagine what we thought. Imagine us trying to think back to what they thinking. A couple of thousand years ago, whatever it was.
Have no idea.
I
I
mean, the
agree.
paradigm.
Wait, so you guys didn't have designated rooms for like crying and dealing with your emotions?
No,
Is that what you're
we were
saying?
just said. No, we said you've been naughty. Go to the corner for 5 minutes or a minute, or whatever your age was. If you're three, go to the corner for 3 minutes. And that was our punishment.
Oh,
There wasn't a
oh,
safe
just
space. There's nothing wrong.
one
The
thing
punish.
quickly. I remember
Uh,
getting a bit tearful at a crack, and my dad said, "You cry for nothing. I'll give you a reason to cry. Keep it up." So you just like hold
well,
that.
David, that might be because he didn't have any eyebrows.
Yeah, that's true.
Now, I saw something. I saw something on Facebook that was also quite interesting. So it's from the times when we were growing up. So this one kid turned around to the father and he says, "Dad, I think I'm gay." And the father turns around to him and says, "Shut up, son, you're not." And that was the end of the conversation. Today you don't. Your kid becomes gay and you buy him. And it's ridiculous. Anyway, guys,